Welcome to the first edition of the Parliament Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Segadin, online managing editor of Temple Law Review Volume 91. Our hope is to utilize these podcasts to speak with Temple Law alums and local attorneys about issues facing the Philadelphia legal community, current events, and simply to share interesting stories and career paths. Our first guest is Stephen Silver. Stephen and I will be discussing the Supreme Court's Murphy v. NCAA decision and how sports gambling is playing out locally. We thank you for listening and hope that you enjoy. I'm very excited to welcome Stephen Silver to our first Parliament podcast. Stephen is a 2013 graduate of Temple Law, an associate at a firm up in Portland, Maine, author of the Legal Blitz, and he'll be teaching a class on sports betting and fantasy sports at the University of Maine this fall. Today we'll be talking about the Supreme Court's Murphy versus NCAA decision, which is obviously enabling states to legalize sports betting, and we'll also talk about some related considerations. Stephen, I guess before we get into the meat of our conversation, can you talk a little bit about your previous career as a sports journalist and kind of how you kept that interest alive with your writing?
Sure. So, I went to journalism school for undergrad. Went to Northwestern. We like to think we're the best, and never had any dreams of going to law school. And actually, right after I graduated, I started writing for the Tennessean in Nashville, covering different things, minor league sports, kind of special events. And believe it or not, at the time, which is 2008, videos and audio being on newspaper websites was just in the infancy. I mean, it was somewhat unheard of. The traditional newspapers just couldn't figure out how to use the web. Even at that time, and Facebook was probably, I think, 4 years old at the time. So anyway, had an opportunity to go to Las Vegas, at the Las Vegas Sun and kind of do a mix of multimedia things and got to cover, everything you can imagine out there. And while there, decided, I was kind of surrounded by lawyers and agents and general managers of different teams and thought, I could do that. I'm just as smart as these people. And still liked writing, but not necessarily the daily type of game stories and things that a sports reporter does. So again, never envisioned going to Temple. Didn't even know anyone in Philadelphia at the time. I'm from Pittsburgh originally, kind of thought I would go to Pitt. Came to Admitted Students Day, met Dean Epps. Was sold pretty much on the spot, and ended up there. And while in law school, actually, one of my section mates, who was a sports reporter but on the TV side for an NBC affiliate, we got this idea to start a sports law blog. It's called the Legal Blitz, which is not updated as frequently anymore, but that's what I write under. I often write under that handle. And while in law school, we kind of got the idea, like, look, all these cool people, whether they're attorneys or agents or whoever, they'll talk to us because we're students. If you just, even if you're a normal reporter or whatever, they might think you want something, they're less trustworthy. But as students, just, hey, I want to do a Q&A with you, kind of like we're doing now. And I got to meet a lot of, really interesting people with diverse backgrounds, doing cool things in sports. And that's when I kind of realized, like, you don't have to be an agent or work for a team or a league to do sports law, so to speak, which is a broad topic. And figured, look, I don't really have many connections, but I am a reporter by trade and can write and, started the blog, started kind of freelancing for different sites, and now, pretty regularly try to contribute to Vice Sports or Above the Law, and briefly some crossover with Deadspin before the Hulk Hogan case. So Above the Law has been great because you can really dive into the legal, for lawyers or law students type of legal nuances. Vice is more of a mainstream audience, but I've enjoyed writing for both. And in the past year or so, it's been a lot of focus, as we're talking about now, on sports betting, because to me, that's the number one kind of sports legal issue that has happened recently.
And I guess to take it from there, and talk a little about what you've written, and I guess how you've approached the Murphy versus NCAA case. I know it's been one of the main things that you've written about in probably in the past year. I guess back in October, you handicapped how the justices would approach Murphy versus NCAA, and you predicted this was obviously a case with New Jersey being the initiating party. You predicted a 6-3 New Jersey win with Kagan, Sotomayor, and Breyer dissenting. In the end, it was a 7-2 win, and Kagan and Breyer, at least Breyer in part, went New Jersey's side, and Ginsburg wrote the dissent. I guess, how do you think this played out behind the scenes? And I guess, would you say, to forward a very lame joke, that your bet covered, but maybe you missed the over-under?
Well, so it's funny you bring it up because, it's been reported both ways as either 6-3 or 7-2. Like, there's no consistency in it. And I actually looked because I knew I was going to talk to you, and, like, go to SCOTUS blog. It's on, which is a great resource if anyone listening doesn't know, but, they've got great analysis and links to all the opinions. And they have it 6-3. Even though I really,
they have Breyer
even though
joining? Right.
Okay. I don't actually know. I probably should before the class starts. But I lean 7-2 because he's concurring in part and dissenting in part. Others, to me it's not a dissent, but it's been reported both ways. But that's actually an interesting. It's short, his concurrence. An interesting read. I think it's like 2-3 pages at the max.
It's very short.
But the part that he dissents about is whether you can sever PASPA. Maybe this is getting ahead of ourselves, but that's a key part. I mean, that changes the whole reading of the case. So I actually really do think he's more of a dissent, because you can't really concur with the holding if you're saying, well, no, PASPA is constitutional.
Exactly.
You can just sever this little part out. I mean, that's not what the majority held. So that's a pretty interesting way of going about things. But in terms of Ginsburg's opinion or dissent, that is not a surprise. I think, just looking at ideological lines and some of her past opinions, PASPA's come up a few times in Supreme Court opinions in dissents. That was totally predictable, and I think here the politics kind of fit neatly as to how you would expect them to happen.
And I want to touch base on the Ginsburg dissent, and as you mentioned, if you read it, Justice Breyer is concurring and dissenting, but as you mentioned, what he's really talking about is further in line with Justice Ginsburg. But before we get there, I wanted to ask a question or two in between. And I guess the first one is, I guess, for people who aren't necessarily familiar with this case, and I guess what the heck's happening and why we're talking about it. Basically, it's based around New Jersey trying to prove that the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, PASPA, is unconstitutional. And it seems, though, just reading some articles as this was coming down the pike, it seems that New Jersey originally had the opportunity to be grandfathered into sports betting, missed the deadline, realized, oh my God, there's money to be had here, and then tried to attack the law to kind of get back in. I guess, I know you've been tracking this for much longer than I have. I guess, is it more complicated than that? Was this really just kind of an opportunity that New Jersey sought to, get some tax revenue?
Well, I think there's a lot of interest at play. Yes, when PASPA, went into effect, there were several states grandfathered, as we say they are, and there's actually there's a little debate as to what states qualified and which didn't, but New Jersey was one of them, and Delaware had a version of like sports lotteries, which is how they've had like these parlay card picks that you can do up until now, where now they're fully operational with sports betting, single bet sports betting. So, New Jersey missed the boat, so to speak. As I've written about, at that time, Donald Trump was a casino owner and was a very vocal supporter of sports betting and trying to get this done. And then his administration went the exact opposite when it came time to they weren't a party to litigation, but to intervene because the court called for the views of the Solicitor General. So fast forward, that's in the 90s, fast forward to, I think 2010, 2011, there's a voter referendum, decent margin of New Jersey voters approve that they want this. And I think the impetus is that, look, Atlantic City was going through a really hard time. I mean, look at 2008, 2009, Atlantic City. That is a depressing, economical place, so to speak. And you have a bunch of casinos closing. Even when I was in law school, they were shutting down casinos. And then since then, obviously, more have gone under or changed hands. And you're looking at Nevada and you're saying, well, hold on a second. How can they do this? They have not only the revenue that comes from sports betting, but all the ancillary revenue from alcohol, food, hotel stays. I mean, there's basically tourism set up around sports betting. March Madness in Las Vegas is, they're probably at 100% occupancy rate. And there's no games there, right? There's no live basketball games to go watch. People are going there to have the rooms that have 50, 100 TVs and to bet on it. So, all that plays into, well, there's money to be made. We need to put people to work, tax revenue, and just kind of a fundamental unfairness. Not to mention, I think a market opportunity where New Jersey figured we can probably get out in front of Pennsylvania, New York, some of the other regional big states and get a market share and make Atlantic City, make it great again, I suppose.
Oh, wow, what'd you get?
So that played into it, and I think that obviously their position was right, but there could be a whole civil procedure class taught on what happened in this case, because they got two hearings at the Third Circuit. I mean,
they did,
that's a rarity.
And I guess to speak a little bit about the case, because again, when we were first interacting, I had just had a kind of a rudimentary understanding of what was going on here, and you were talking about this in some of your earlier writings that this might seem like a pretty silly sports betting case, but in actuality, especially for liberal justices, this is a pretty tough thing because it's really a 10th Amendment case, and I think 1L con law students would be very happy to know that Justice Alito's opinion is peppered with cases that they probably read last year or going to read this year: Prince, New York, Reno, and basically the question was, can the federal government be prevented from only asking states to take affirmative actions or any actions? And then Justice Alito chose the latter. I guess did any of this surprise you? I know you predicted that this was going to be, I guess, what this was all going to be about. But I guess did anything about the majority opinion kind of surprise you, or did it kind of fall into where you expected?
Well, I think the surprising thing, I mean, look, this is obviously how I thought they were going to rule, but the surprising thing is really the language of the opinion and how far it goes. I mean, this was not just, PASPA. This was not carved out in a way to be very specific to this challenge. The majority really took this opportunity to really go after the federal power, and this is a huge states' rights, preemption. There's a lot of juicy stuff in here, but yeah, I mean it was not only can Congress not tell the state what to do, but it can't tell the state what not to do.
Exactly.
So you're taking both angles, which is kind of hard to, for some people to parse out. And I would think I think this is the first opinion cited in any future case involving states' rights.
And I did lie. I wanted to ask one more question about Murphy, and it's going to go back to what we were discussing earlier about, okay, well, what side is Breyer on? Did he concur? Did he dissent? And you're talking about his, I guess, concurring dissenting opinion, and it does play into what Justice Ginsburg in her dissent is arguing, which is basically, we're only talking about, I think, two provisions here for the most part. And the argument in the majority is that, well, you can't take these two out. The argument for Justice Ginsburg is, you can just carve these out and without killing PASPA. At the same time, I think, as you mentioned in some of your writing, Justice Alito, at the very close of the majority opinion, kind of leaves the door open for Congress, as Supreme Court cases often do, where if they want to regulate this, they can regulate it. I guess, do you see this issue, on regulating sports betting being revisited by Congress, or do you think at this point, at least in the short term, this is a state issue now?
So, that's a great question. And right away after the decision came out, I think you had, Orrin Hatch and some other, conservative politicians who kind of take this sort of an anti-gambling stance in general. It has nothing to do with PASPA, so to speak, and saying that they're going to introduce some legislation to, work out a ban. And this, Orrin Hatch has done this multiple times in various contexts with any sort of gambling. And I think in the short term, this is just left up to the states.
Okay.
I think that there will be some lobbying, not for a renewed ban on sports betting or some sort of new version of PASPA, but I could see federal legislation involving new tax structures, regulations in terms of some sort of consumer protections. Make sure, one state doesn't allow, one state's gambling age is 18, another's 21, or monitoring, or really, well, what needs to be done in terms of federal legislation is squaring the Wire Act with it. Because, the way I read it, and I know a lot of other lawyers and academics read it, is that, well, if New Jersey, or Delaware have a common sportsbook operator, say, MGM, I know, big operator casinos, or Caesars Entertainment, or William Hill. They've got sports books in multiple states, and if you're sharing data to make your lines, that would seemingly violate the face of the Wire Act. That is preventing the transmission of any data using, wires, which, again, one-hour con law is a pretty broad topic. What does that mean? How can you do that? What if someone's in one state and they're sending information to bet in another? Like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, right? Philly to Atlantic City. How does that play in? Not that individual bettors will get prosecuted, but what about the payment processors? We're going to mobile gaming, so if you can deposit with a credit card, how does that work out? I think there's a lot of issues with that. I don't think we'll see a renewed ban, but and frankly, I'm not sure how they could do it. It's like the cat's out of the bag. We have 4 states up and running now. By the end of this year, it'll at least be 6, if not maybe 7 or 8. And I don't think any of the senators from those states are going to readily, vote against some renewed ban. So, I just don't see it really being politically viable. The other thing that I would look out for is if the sports leagues do not get, what they want in terms of lobbying the states for royalties, although now they're going about it themselves and signing private deals, they could lobby at the federal level to get some sort of a cut, some sort of fee. I don't know how that works. There's currently a federal tax, maybe some new sort of tax, that goes to them, but that could be an option. I just think, considering everything that's going on right now, this is probably second tier at anyone's mind in DC.
And thank you, because you just in that answer kind of previewed a lot of what we're going to finish up here. So we're going to talk a little bit about now, what's going to happen in the fall from Murphy. And I guess those of us living in what I'll call Third Circuit country have seen obviously New Jersey and Delaware step in and be the first two states following Murphy to take this on. New Jersey established betting taxes of 8.5% for bets made on land, 13% for online wagering through casinos, and 14.25% for online wagering through racetracks. Within the first month, $16 million was wagered, including $3.5 million in state revenue. And in Delaware, I guess in the first 3 weeks I was reading, $7 million was wagered, and $1 million in state revenue was generated through 3 casinos. That was all just a lot of background information. But I guess the leading question here is, do you believe, and you just kind of hinted at it, that we'll see kind of a rush of states getting on this action soon?
Yeah, there will be a flood of probably another half dozen states in the very near term. And then I think the next wave will come a little later. I think that, I think it will follow kind of the marijuana track, where some went all in, and then others, it took a while, but they had medical. And then they go from medical to recreational. But then there's delay because, so I'm up here in Maine, so we're fully recreational, but there's no stores selling it yet. The actual infrastructure and the regulations aren't up and running yet. Massachusetts passed it a while ago, but they've still been slowly rolling it out. So I think there's some that, just kind of want to wait and see, learn from the mistakes of some other states, figure out how to do it best, figure out, you've got to balance both the state's interest, which is obviously number one interest, but also the sportsbook operators and the gaming industry, number two, and three is the consumers, and figure out that balance. Because like Pennsylvania right now has some absurd tax rate that they want to use. It's just 30%, Yes. So when you take that, plus all the other taxes an operator pays, plus an enormous licensing fee, there is a federal tax. How can you make any money? And so either, there's some casinos who say, we're just not going to offer sports betting. It's just not lucrative enough. Or they do, and the line, and this is getting really deep into the betting, but the VIG or the lines are so, ridiculous that the consumers never, they're not getting a great shake. And maybe for some people that doesn't really matter. You go to a casino now, probably, all of them in the Philadelphia region, I bet you cannot find a 3-2 blackjack table. Or if you do, maybe there's one on the floor. They're probably all 6-5. Now, to someone who's out to have a few drinks and maybe gamble $100, $200, doesn't really matter. It's not going to cross their mind. Those blackjack tables are going to be full. But, over time, that's worse for the gambler. And people who are, putting a lot of money down, it certainly matters. And the same is for, sports bettors. And the concern is, well, does the big money go to the legal books, or do they continue betting offshore? And then there's no tax revenue from that money. Right now, you see some of the lines coming out of the DraftKings and the FanDuel books, and I think it's just hard to stabilize. The other thing is, you quoted some of the, the amount bets, which I think will, obviously ramp up for football season, but it's funny, it's like in New Jersey, the number of bets put on the closest teams to win the Super Bowl, are so far untethered to the reality of what Las Vegas sees. So, so certainly the lines and the odds will have to adjust over time for sort of the home base fans.
And I guess, we were just talking about new states come in. I know Mississippi on August 1st, we're recording this a few weeks before we're going to release it, but Mississippi recently became the third state to legalize sports betting, I guess in the wake of Murphy. I guess you're talking about, I guess, the states kind of playing it conservative, trying to figure out, okay, what are other states doing incorrectly? What can we do better? I guess is there one or two things that you think they're particularly looking at? Is it just kind of how much money is being made here? Is it tax rates? I guess is there one or two things that you feel as though are really preventing, I guess, a more robust adoption?
So a lot of it is really legislative. Some, some it's just, they have part-time legislators, so, you've got to wait till they're in session to get this moving. Pennsylvania and New Jersey obviously having, being different, they can move pretty fast. Others you've got, so like in Connecticut, for instance, I think that's a state that absolutely wants sports books, but they have different tribal gaming packs. You've got to work that out, and even if everyone's in agreement as to how to resolve that legislatively, you've got to pass things. You've got to craft these statutes, and you've got to be careful. I mean, New Jersey, in their haste to get these sports books open, accidentally banned betting on esports, and esports, is a growing, source of revenue, especially in Vegas for books. So they fixed it. But, things like that happen. These, gaming statutes are often complicated. They're often conflicting with others. You've got to change the gaming laws. You've got to change the criminal statutes, and others is with stakeholders, right? What will the taxes look like? Are there any taxes? Are there any local or municipal taxes for wherever the book is located? Is it just state? Looking at how do you monitor for, addiction? Are we going to let people wager on their mobile devices? There's a lot of states that have casinos, but they do not have internet gaming. And so that's a leap that they have to consider. And also what can be offered, is it just pro sports? Can they bet on college? Are you taking out whatever the local teams are? Are those off the board? Can you bet on the Olympics? There's all kinds of different things that just take time to resolve.
And you mentioned earlier Pennsylvania, and I think we spoke about this before this interview, that Pennsylvania has not been particularly aggressive, or at least with casino betting. You're talking about a tax that will be effectively 36%, and you also mentioned the hefty licensing fee, which would be $10 million per casino. I guess some have called this, some articles have called this a game of chicken between the state and the casinos. Again, we're recording this a few weeks in advance, and in the past few days we've learned that Parks in relatively nearby Bensalem will likely be the first casino to sign up for sports betting in Pennsylvania. I guess, do you see this tax rate, at least in places like Philadelphia where you could, travel across the border pretty easily, I guess, pushing business into New Jersey and Delaware? And I guess from your perspective, with all these considerations that you just mentioned, could Pennsylvania be perhaps pursuing this in a better way?
Well, so I get kind of the both sides of the argument, which is, look, if you want to go put a bet on before, the Eagles game, you're just going to go wherever's closest. But at the same time, I know very few people in Philadelphia that, when they're planning ahead, buy their alcohol there.
Yeah.
They go to Delaware or New Jersey, or really any big purchases. So, I mean, if consumers are thinking about that, then of course they're going to look at this. I mean, if you live in Delco or heck, even parts of South Philly, you're not going to drive the Parks. You might as well go to Delaware and, see what the lines are. Now, that also assumes that cost will get pushed down to the consumer. Maybe it's not, I think over time, the casinos are going to have to get it, because they're going to have to stay in this race with their competitors, like certainly Parks makes sense. They have a big racetrack, it caters to a certain community. Is there such a demand at Sugar House? I don't know, but I bet they would get it if, everyone in Atlantic City has a book and so does Parks. I would, so it's one of those things. I think eventually they'll suck it up and pay. But you know, it's a it's a hefty price tag, and maybe is a loss leader for some time. But I think there's a general misunderstanding about how much money sportsbooks make. You know, I mean, a good book is a profit of maybe 5%. You know, in Nevada. So, you know, we're not talking gigantic margins here.
Yeah. And I guess I want to talk to you a little bit about some areas that you mentioned earlier at the top of our call, I guess that are maybe not directly related to the sports betting as we think about it, but do come up a lot. And one is integrity fees, and the other we'll talk about in a little bit is data and statistics. I guess one of the things that you just mentioned that leagues have been lobbying for in recent months, even before Murphy, when it, as you mentioned, you know, it was kind of clear how Murphy would turn out, has been these integrity fees. And I guess one of the ones that I read recently in Indiana seeks a 1% fee on all wagers, not the state revenue itself, but basically any dollar that's bet, in return for preserving the integrity of the game. This is obviously interesting for some of us who watch a lot, as you see things like the NFL has injury reports for no real other reason other than sports betting. I guess, you know, are you surprised that they're asking for this with a straight face? And I guess, what reason do states have, if any, to cut these leagues in?
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised they're asking for it. You know, I think, look, hindsight's 20/20, but if 5-6 years ago the league made a strategic decision to say, hey, New Jersey, you want to do this? It's going to require effort to get around PASPA. Like, let's get together, and, you know, I think collectively they could have gotten it done with all of their influence. And by the way, in exchange for us helping you get this, we want, you know, X%. I have no doubt that would have been done. I mean, but instead it was guns a-blazing, you know, litigating this to the, you know, end of the earth, to the Supreme Court, and then realizing, which I think almost all people who watched that case, who listened to the oral arguments, knew they were going to lose. I mean, there was no doubt in my mind after the oral arguments. And now the strategy turns to, well, okay, it's coming, so, you know, you should pay us because we're going to incur more costs. You know, that might be true. I mean, I don't think that that's disingenuous. I think there will be extra costs. But at the same time, you've had those. Why weren't you doing it all along? I mean, Nevada's been wagering a ton of money on sports for a lot of years. You weren't getting anything from them. People have been wagering billions of dollars on offshore sites. You knew that's going on. I mean, like you said, injury reports are exclusively for that.
Exactly.
The games are televised in a certain way for that. That's the only reason why Thursday Night Football gets the ratings it does. I mean, or why the MAC plays on Wednesday. You know, I mean, it's all driven by gambling. So what were you doing all those years? You know,
exactly.
What are these new costs? And look, maybe there's a way to compensate accordingly, but the initial push maybe was a negotiating stance, which was 1% of the handle, which is 1% of everything wagered. It is not of the profit. I mean, that's an absolutely enormous amount of money if you just do it that way. So then they cut it back. I think in some states it went to 0.25%, and then they switched from integrity fees to admitting that it's just a royalty. But I think the path is what the NBA has done with MGM, which is get a private licensing deal. The leagues control information. I mean, that is now their most valuable property in my mind, is information and data.
And you mentioned, and you were just talking about that. We're going to get to that deal in just a second, but before we get there, I just wanted to interject, I guess, a second question before we move on to data, which is, you were mentioning the MACtion. You know, I love watching Toledo football on a Tuesday night as much as anybody. I guess, I was reading a Washington Post interview with Professor Ryan Rodenberg at Florida State University, and his contention was that even though leagues might want these integrity fees, the amount of money players make nowadays, even the lower end players, there's the opportunity for a monetary incentive is very, very low. But for college players, which I'm sure everybody follows to a certain extent, the financial incentive is very much greater. I guess there are rumors now that we were just talking about the gambling-friendly maneuver of injury reports. There's rumors that college football will soon adopt those. I guess how do you see this? As obviously, compensating college athletes is in the periphery. But I guess how do you see that being related to what we're talking about here with these integrity fees and with, I guess, keeping the game clean?
Well, I guess it all comes down to what changed, right? Nothing changed. People have been wagering billions of dollars for years on these events. Now you're just thinking that they might do it in a licensed and regulated sports book that is tracking their bets. I mean, if anything, it got easier for the leagues, because if you see some enormous, bizarre swings and wagers put down on some random game that normally wouldn't attract the attention, you probably know that there's something going on, or at least it would raise the alarms, and you could monitor in terms of watching the game action. I mean, there's professionals who do this. I mean, they can spot these things. Nothing changed other than you brought it out of the black market, so to speak, into a legal and regulated market. So why weren't you monitoring for this before? I mean, I think to me that's what it all comes back to. Nothing has changed now, other than the leagues partnering with sportsbook operators. To me, is really dicey. I mean, if you have a questionable catch call or any NBA game really with the refereeing that we saw in the playoffs, if that's good for the books, what are the fans going to think? I mean, I think it's a tricky relationship. It's certainly not an easy position, but again, this isn't new. It's not that suddenly overnight now everyone can gamble. Everyone's already been gambling. It's just going to be done in different ways now. And frankly, at a college level, we've seen scandals, right? I mean, we've seen point-saving scandals in the past. That same threat is out there, but I actually think, if anything, legalizing sports betting reduces the threat. Because again, you can monitor it. You can see where the bets are coming from. It reduces some of the money and the power from bookies or people who are doing things offshore. So I don't think it really changes much for the league.
And before you were rudely interrupted by me, you were talking about the NBA MGM deal, which was recently announced. And I think that's a nice transition from the integrity fees that we're talking about to our final topic, which will be game data and stats. The deal will net the NBA $25 million over the next 3 years. That's obviously peanuts. You can't even get it back up a 3-and-D wing for that kind of money. But I guess this idea that the NBA and MGM will share data, I was reading a Sports Illustrated article. Maybe the NBA is better set up to monitor the integrity of the game, as you were mentioning. Are there wild swings in games that you weren't anticipate them to be? And maybe MGM has better data to set betting lines, which is a peculiar way of going about things. But I guess, what kind of precedent do you think that this sets? Because you're talking about a situation, as you mentioned earlier, where the leagues were fighting New Jersey on this, and now they're not only not fighting it anymore, but they're asking both the states and now it seems the casinos for a cut in the action.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The initial reaction from a lot of other kind of media, sports law type people, was how great this was. And I don't think it's a bad deal. I just think it puts them in a tougher position when you go in front of a legislative committee to say, yeah, I mean, we can negotiate these private deals, and in fact we have, but you should pay us too. I mean, if I'm, and the spin will be, look, the casinos, who are the ones who are really lobbying against the fees or the royalties at the state level, because it cuts in their margins. Well, they're paying us. They've agreed that what we have to offer is valuable. And so that's why state senator should, cut us in. But, if I'm sitting on that committee, I say, well, hold on. Then if if there's money to be made, then go negotiate yourself. You're clearly capable of negotiating a licensing deal or a partnership. So go do it. You don't need, it doesn't need to come out of the taxpayers. I think they had to do something. I think this is the model. You'll see some leagues, continue to press forward and ignore this. The NBA and obviously Commissioner Silver has always been at the forefront of this issue. I mean, he wrote that New York Times op-ed years ago, where he was calling for a federal solution, but, they are a more progressive league than the others.
Absolutely.
And, this is the way to go because information about everything is very valuable. Obviously, there's some value to the licensing aspect in terms of being able to use logos, branded type of things. I don't know what all it will encompass, but, sports books don't use team logos or colors. They just use the city name. So, there's value to that. And real-time in-game betting, which is the future. I mean, it exists, but that's where this is all going. The transmission of live data is extremely valuable. And we see it on the various stock exchanges now. If you can get a nanosecond faster than whatever, your computer program can make those transactions faster. I mean, there's probably billions or more, earned and lost in these fractions of second transactions. So transmission and access to that data is extremely valuable. I think this deal, which is a rather small amount, is probably kind of testing the waters, and that will change over time. But, there's value there. I think this is the way that the league should go. And if you're a sportsbook operator, $25 million versus, and again, that's MGM, which they'll have multiple sportsbooks in various states. So that's a great deal for them versus 1% across what could be eventually dozens of sportsbooks.
And the point you just made, I was reading a New York Times article recently, and it was focused on soccer in England. And to your exact point, there's been crackdowns of people sitting in the stadium and sending out transmissions of who scored, where in the net did it land, that sort of thing. And to your point, there's a lot of money in that kind of real-time data. And to the point that you also made about the I guess relatively modest sum, obviously owners of the NBA seem pretty sure that there's more money to be had here than is in that deal. I know shortly after the Murphy decision, Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban remarked that the value of the teams in all four major sports had just doubled. I guess aside from the increased interest in the games themselves, which obviously fantasy sports shows, people care more when they have another stake in the game. And the MGM deal we just talked about, that same New York Times article is talking about a company such as Sports Radar in Switzerland, and they have already entered into private data agreements with the NBA, NFL, and NHL. Stats, I mean, for novices such as myself, I know that they've been a huge part of sports fandom. I know fantasy sports, it's a huge part of, how that functions. I guess where do you see, if we're talking about this same topic in a few years, I guess what do you think we'd be talking about in terms of ownership of data, storage, how that's all kind of playing out?
Yeah, well, Sports Radar is definitely the leader right now, and we'll see who else enters the market. But there's two tiers, so that is valuable, but also, the league's real moneymaker are TV deals. So we've been in a period of declining ratings, declining cable subscriptions, all of that for years. This, I think, is not only the savior, but will probably increase all of that. I mean, that's the real money. Is from these TV deals, and there's been all this talk of, look, ESPN is hemorrhaging subscribers left and right, laying off people. Same with some of the other networks that, when all the major TV deals are up for renegotiation in a few years, the leagues are going to really take a beating. This might change that. I don't know a media outlet that is not planning a show or a column or a site dedicated to sports betting. I mean, everyone is. And what would have been unheard of, in the past for some of the traditional media companies that, in the leagues themselves, maybe they'll start producing stuff. But there's no doubt this drives eyeballs, it drives viewership. And Mark Cuban knows what he's talking about. Whether it's streaming stuff online or watching on TV, this brings more eyeballs. It makes everything you have. And not only that, you've in a sense, right, you've owned these players. You've owned the logos. You've owned the property. Now you just got, the stuff that you've had and maybe taken for granted, that just became a gold mine, which is the data and information about the players, the games, all of that, is pretty valuable. We're talking, it could even be down to the ice conditions in an arena, before a playoff game. I mean, all of a sudden you've got that. And not to mention advertising opportunities. If you look internationally, every stadium and team probably has some, advertising from different gaming entities, if not on their jerseys or at least in the stadium. We haven't seen that, as much here. I think we will. What about in-stadium betting? Hey, MGM or Caesars, you want to put a kiosk in here so people can bet? It's going to cost you, and I think there's just a lot more opportunities for business to be done.
And I guess along the same lines, the information itself is, I know you're mentioning, more eyeballs and more interest, but I guess the information itself, it might be treated differently than it is today, where I guess, there's a sense as, okay, I know, basic stats about, almost any team that I want to know about, but it's also, I guess, that data has just become more valuable to a certain extent, at least with casinos and companies willing to pay for it.
That's right. You've always had the goods, so to speak, but you just didn't have the market to sell it. Now you do.
Yes. You had all these cows and nobody wanted to drink milk, and now people do, I guess. I guess, like Stephen, I thank you so much for taking some time. This was really a great way to start the podcast. I guess, like any good contract, I want to end on one kind of catch-all provision. In your writing, you've written a lot about Murphy before Murphy, after Murphy, and you've gotten into some really interesting areas, talking about how this impacts state revenue, cryptocurrency, the legalization of marijuana, sanctuary cities, and it can go on and on. I'm not going to take up any more of your time this afternoon. But I guess for those listening who are really interested in the subject, maybe they're interested in state sovereignty, maybe they just want to sound really smart at the next party they're at, I guess what would you like to leave them with in terms of what's interesting to you at this point with this debate?
Well, so I think number one, if you just want to sound smart and you'll put yourself above, at least half of the people out there, that the Supreme Court did not legalize sports betting. I mean, this is misreported, and I hear, people on major television shows and radio shows say this all the time. That's not what they did, right? They declared PASPA unconstitutional and said states, if they want to, now have the freedom to decide if they want to legalize sports betting or not. So it is not just, hey, I can go bet on sports now wherever I live. That's not how it works. So to consider that, and then number two would be to think about, right, what else does this apply to, right? Sports betting is it's a tangible thing we can all kind of think about, and it's fun, and we've probably done it in some way or another, whether legal or not. So what else can this touch on, right? And so if you're thinking about marijuana, which I think is the next, I think it's going to be headed for some sort of Supreme Court showdown at some point in the near future, is, well, there's a federal law that prohibits that. But here we have states who do it or want to do it. So, hey, why can you, Congress, tell the states what to do? Now, that's not necessarily what they're doing. Obviously, the statutes are different, but it's something to think about. Same with any situation where Congress is forbidding a state from either acting or preventing them from not acting. I guess would be another way to look at it. How does that stand now? Particularly with what will be an even more conservative court, probably within the next few months. If all the justices stay to what was a very predictable, predictable voting pattern, especially on this case, what's next? And so what I'd like to see is something that is, traditionally liberal, let's say like marijuana, but come in front of the courts in this very states' rights, almost libertarian way, right? Because sports betting kind of cuts in all directions. So this was an easy one for them. But what happens when it's a little harder and you've got this opinion out there? So, I think, and also if there's law students listening and this case is not taught in your con law course, you better raise your hand and ask why. Because, I think this is one of the most major, that kind of traditional 10th Amendment type of case we've seen in a long time, so it should absolutely be taught.
As you mentioned, it might make for some strange bedfellows with, the next legalized marijuana case. Maybe in sanctuary cities, you might have a situation where a conservative court is, kind of torn in that way as well. Stephen, I think that's it for here. Thank you so much for taking some time. This was excellent, and great talking to you.
All right, thank you.
Take care. Thank you for tuning into the Parliament Podcast. In our next episode, we will welcome Judge Nelson Diaz. Judge Diaz was the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's first Latino judge. He also served as general counsel for the Department of Housing and Urban Development under President Bill Clinton and city solicitor under Mayor John Street. We hope that you join us.